Welcome to another episode of Everyday Witchcraft, and I'd like to introduce our special guest, Dr. Bones. Dr. Bones, how are you?
Doing great. How about yourself?
I'm great. I'm so glad you're on the show today because there's so many things I want to ask you about this topic. But first, I'd like you to introduce yourself and tell people a little bit about you.
Hi, I'm Dr. Bones. I've grew up in the Eastern Smoky Mountains pretty much my whole life, growing up and then moving around a lot and started exploring witchcraft probably in my early teenagers, I'd say 14, 15. Realized, growing up we were doing Appalachian witchcraft and then moved on with life and studied more of it and decided I wanted to teach and, you know, root
Here you
worker.
are. Yep, and here you go.
So
So I'd like to start with exactly is Appalachian witchcraft? I mean, is it different from folk magic, or can you just give us a little information about that?
Yeah, for sure. Appalachian witchcraft is a conglomeration of a lot of things. It started from immigrants moving into the Appalachian area, the Irish, Celts, Gaelic, Africans moving in, and it's come from all these places. It really embodies the melting pot of practices. You have traditions from Christianity, traditions from Hoodoo, traditions from Voodoo, old Gaelic traditions. And it really just conglomerates into that. And then after all that, you have the rich history going on of how we have evolved and grew up in Appalachia and living day to day and using these spells. This way of living has changed and evolved on our day to day basis based on our needs. And a lot of people don't even know, still to this day in this region, you're doing old things you watched your grandparents do, and you're performing Appalachian witchcraft. You're
I
doing
would have never
conjure work.
guessed that. What's the history behind it? I mean, how far does it go back?
Oh Lord, it's hard to say. If you really want to get technical, Appalachian witchcraft goes back to the Native Americans, really. I mean, they were the first here. They were here first. You had the Cherokee, the Blackfoot, and Choctaws, the Cree. It can go back to them, and if you want to take it really far back, it can go as far back as the Gaelics, as far back as I've traced it so far. Because that's really a lot of the root of it comes from that era, and then other eras kind of blended in over time. It's old. It's
Been around a
BC
while. Okay,
old.
what's the difference? How does it differ from other forms of witchcraft? Because you mentioned it has like different faiths and traditions in it. What makes it different from other traditions?
I would say what makes it different from other traditions is going along the lines of, excuse me, uh, we have taken the traditions from other religions and other practices over the years and over the centuries and morphed them in to our way of living. And over time, that has changed the way some of those traditions were done. For example, you want to, one of the examples of old Gaelic tradition used to be you could take and have a sick baby in the house. You had the root worker or the sin eater or the witch doctor back then, and that person would be living way far away from most civilizations. Someone had a baby that was sick, they would take him to the doctor, take it to the doctor. The baby would be verified as sick, and then the baby would stay with the witch doctor, and everyone would leave. And that was and then the baby would stay there for a week, and then would either live or pass, depending on what the balance was supposed to be. But the witch doctor would do the worker, whatever they have so many names for him back then, would do the work on the baby. It's evolved and changed. Now you take that same instance and you add in now no one can come in and out of your house because back in the early times of being in the Appalachian area, these mountains are old, and they believe from other traditions, like from the Irish coming in and some Christianity being blended into it. If someone was to walk in and out of that house, you would now re-dirty the house. Therefore, the work would not be complete.
Can you kind of give us a little brief on the differences between hoodoo, voodoo, Appalachian witchcraft? Is there a lot of differences between them, or are they kind of similar where people can work with all three?
There's a lot of differences really between all three of them. Voodoo is an old religion from Africa. You know, the Africans practice it, and they have their own certain ways of working with the laws and stuff, as I do. And then there's hoodoo, which the difference between, and it's really hard to figure it out if you don't do your research. That's the main difference between hoodoo and voodoo. Voodoo was around before we imported Africans into slavery, unfortunately. When we did that, it's a terrible time of history, but it's, we did it, and that's what bred hoodoo. Because when they were on the plantations as slaves, they would get in some serious trouble for practicing voodoo. So they would start hiding it. And one of the ways they hid it, that they were doing their work, is start working with like Saint Anthony or Saint Expedite, Saint Jude, and they would start working with the saints in place of the laws. And root work kind of picked up a whole lot more in hoodoo, and then it did voodoo. Voodoo has root work, but it was limited to certain roots. And when we came up here in the hoodoo and the Appalachian region and all that, the southern areas, you have a lot more roots to work with. So roots became a big practice into the hoodoo side of things. And then when hoodoo joined in moved on up into the Appalachian area, it changed up even more into the fact of, because at first the roots that we were using were for holistic purposes. They were for actual medicine. You know, if someone was sick, had a cough, we would give them horehound and horehound and lemongrass. And then we use it for medicinal, and then hoodoo started getting mixed in a little bit, and we started learning that we could use these roots for spirituality purposes as well. So now all of a sudden we understood that we could take cinnamon, clove, if we could get a hold of cinnamon, or you could take a hold of pepper or sulfur from around here and make a protection powder or oil if you so choose to do. There's just different things that they did of that nature, but now they're completely three different.
Okay. Well, let me ask you one more question. You mentioned using the Bible in your workings. What Bible do you use? Because there's so many different versions out there. So what version do you use?
That's a great question. I'm actually still on a journey of finding a proper Bible that I personally would love to have. That would find is perfect for my workings. I have my grandmother's Bible, and then I have a Bible that was gifted to me by a friend from long ago who helped me start learning a little bit more about Christianity. It's a lesson Bible. It teaches more on the plain terms of things. And then my grandmother's Bible is just a really old King James Bible.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask you.
Personally,
Does it have to be King James, or like I have a learning Bible that's a Lutheran learning Bible, so it doesn't matter which one you have them.
As long as you have the Old Testament, it really doesn't, because that's really what they went by, was the Old Testament of things.
Okay.
There really wasn't a whole lot of, they were really superstitious about the New Testament of things and all of that when it started coming in, because Appalachians are not one to change. We don't like change. We don't like influences coming in and changing things up. So when it does, it's an uproar. So there was always the old belief in the Old Testament.
So it's the
I
Old
personally,
Testament then.
yep.
Is that
And then
okay?
the book of hymns, we work in that a lot as well. I personally just haven't found a Bible that I fell in love with yet, but it'll come in one day.
So what does it take to practice Appalachian witchcraft? I mean, are certain tools, or what do you use?
That's a great question. Really, ingenuity, imagination. uh, Not much tools wise. I have a lot of tools I've gathered over the years of doing different things. Primarily am a root worker. One of the biggest things of Appalachian witchcraft and conjure was working with the roots, and we used them for medicine. The Smoky Mountains is older than bones, and there is everything we need for medicine back in those early times is here. So that's what we use. So we went and picked our roots, we learned them, and we used them. So, you know, you got your basic root working, you got baskets, mortar and pestles, stuff to store them in, jars. Every witch loves jars. Everyone loves jars. You need jars. um, and then, you know, depending on what you want to go down, like everyone communicates differently. It's done a little differently. You could go to one root worker, or the name for them used to be grannies or Yorubas, and you could go to one granny and she would do something a little different from another granny. It's just certain things are passed down through the family lineage. So, you know, basic root working, um, your way to talk to the spirits. And sitting here looking back at my tarot cards and my conjure cards, you know, a lot of the
Yeah, I'm going to
times
ask you
people
about
would,
that too, by the way. Your
yeah,
divination. I do want to get into that.
oh, for sure. Yeah, for sure. A lot of the times people would do conjure cards. You know, they would have a playing deck of cards. That's a tool. A simple deck of playing cards. One of your biggest tools you can use. Really, other than that, it was just as simple as setting up an altar for, and at the core of it, it was simple as setting up an altar for the ancestors and honoring them. And, you know, and honoring them, you live by the lessons they've taught, and you live honorably through them, and you pass down the knowledge. And it was really a practice built out of not having anything, because what we had to make. You know, I even grew up in a floor with a dirt floor, or a house with a dirt floor, excuse me, for a long time. And you do with what you have. That's the beauty thing. And that's, I guess you could say, is one of the things that makes it different from everything else. A lot of the other things, certain religions, you have to have certain ingredients or certain things to do stuff. Here, it's all about your ingenuity. Hey, there's 3 sticks. I can make a ward out of 3 sticks and hang it on my property, and it keeps evil spirits out. It was all about intention.
Okay, is it like hoodoo then? Do they kind of mesh together, or is that completely different?
Voodoo, not so much. You know, I've studied voodoo. Voodoo's more of its own religion, and then voodoo is also the breeder of hoodoo. You know, hoodoo was the combination of, voodoo was the primary religion of the Africans that unfortunately were slaves. You know, it's a terrible time and it shouldn't have happened, but that's what happened. And to blend in, the Christianity got mixed into voodoo, and we have hoodoo. And, you know, everyone around at that time was doing root work. Root work is just as simple of learning to use your herbs for spiritual and physical medicine. Everyone was doing it back then. So that was already in it. And then hoodoo kind of blended into it during the fact when Africans started moving up, like in South Carolinas and the North Carolinas. Some of the practices started blending in, and some of it's amazing. Some of the things were already there. You know, voodoo and hoodoo has mojo bags. They have gree-grees. We have our own version of gree-grees. We have our own version of voodoo dolls, so to speak. So a lot of that was already in Appalachian witchcraft, but it was really heavily influenced and brought in more into it once the hoodoo came into it. But it's not so much like voodoo as more as it is hoodoo.
Did you like what do you use to celebrate your ancestors? Is it do you have an altar? Do you have a shrine? What would you use to do that?
Yeah, you can see right behind me, kind of see it. It's
Mhm.
lean out of the way here. You can kind of see I have a little desk here. On the desk part I use as my workstation for doing spells and just day-to-day stuff for witchcraft. It's not my everyday workstation. Keep that away from it, and everyday objects away from it. And then above it I have the stuff for, I practice voodoo and a little bit of hoodoo, and I have my walls, and then I have the candles lit right now, offerings to my ancestors. And then we have, in my house, we have another ancestor altar set up. I just, all you have is just basic table, white cloth, and some offerings, something that your ancestors loved, you know, tobacco, fruit, food. Give them a little feedings, honor them, keep it clean. Give them a little drink there with them, just something simple like that. Have some photos up if you have them, you know, or maybe a grandpa's pipe or something. I have one of my grandpa's knives on mine that I found over the several years, and it's up there now.
So you keep your altars separate, correct? You don't mix the ancestral altar because that's what I do. I have a few altars in my home. I keep them all separate. I have the working altar, the ancestral altar, and another altar like for healing and things like that. You keep yours separate then?
Yeah, for sure. Like my ancestor altar is completely separate and then a whole nother part of the house through this door here behind me. And then like this is more of my working altar behind me. And then if I have to get into some real heavy work, I have another altar to my left over here in another room. And that's for doing, and that's also where I store my herbs and my apothecary. But that's, yeah, I definitely keep them separate because you don't want to mix energies from, say you're doing some left-handed work and you don't want that in your ancestor altar and they don't want that in there and they're definitely going to let you know.
No, they don't want that. Okay, so you mentioned left-handed work. Can you talk to me about that a little bit? Because most of our viewers, they don't practice anything from the left-handed path. They practice more light path. But can you explore that a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. That's a great question. It gets brought up to me a lot, and I talk to a lot of people about it. And it's one of the biggest things I preach about. I didn't say preach, but talk about with Appalachian conjure, hoodoo, and root work. Any of it. It's you have to have balance. Everything is balanced. There's the yin and the yang. There's sun and z. There's totally different things left and right. You have to have the main balance of everything, though. You can't be just doing dark stuff and just doing light stuff. Doing dark stuff could be as simple as the left-handed path, as it's called. This could be as simple as doing something for yourself. Say, I need some funds coming in, or I need a job. That's technically considered left-handed work. Or you could be doing something as simple as casting wards around your house, or cleansing your house, or making a healing spell or protection oil or something. That's right-handed work. And and everything you've got to have the balance. You can't just do one or the other. And also, if you start doing some of that was one of our biggest beliefs in Appalachian conjure and witchcraft. The granny doing the spells, if there was any spells deemed to be for someone being wronged in the village or anything of that nature, or coronation of a baby coming in, they would talk with the spirits through various forms of divination, and they would see if what their actions were going to be in balance, because they can't be tipping this balance scales either. So if they were going to be doing left-handed work, someone commissioned them to do left-handed work. If the spirit said no, then it wasn't happening because it was going to be out of balance.
That makes sense. So, prior to doing all of the work, any kind of work, do you always consult like your ancestors, or it just with the left-handed magic? Do you consult them?
Oh yes, absolutely. I consult them all the time, and I use it more as I talk to them on a daily basis. Our main ancestor altar is set up where you walk by it multiple times a day. And so, we can stop and look at it. And at night, sometimes we open the case up and light candles in there. And we're always communicating with our ancestors around here. And that's one of the biggest things with this is you were always talking with the ancestors. It wasn't just when you need them, because you don't just go up to a random family member out, and only talk to them when you need something. If you really care about them and their family, you talk to them all the time. You check in on them. You're doing the same with the ancestors because they're always there. They're always watching you. And yes, my thing is they have more wisdom than I do. You know, I know a lot about this stuff and I can do a lot. Not to toot my own horn, but I don't know everything, and I never will know everything. It's always a learning journey. But they have the wisdom, and always talk with them about doing some work, especially if someone's commissioned it for you. Like one of the old things is an old spell is someone you has wronged you or a family member or is threatening you. They're a threat. They need, and you're scared, or someone else is a threat to someone else and they're coming to you for advice and help. You take their name, write it on a piece of parchment paper, and you go with and you think with the intention of, you know, talk with the ancestors exactly how I've never done this spell and it works. One of the things I've done is I talk with the ancestors. This is so and so. This is what they're doing. It's wrong. Please help me balance this out. Someone has come to me asking for help, or I'm asking for help, and now I'm asking you for help balancing this out. And you go to a tree, You find a tree with a fork in it or a tree with a knot in it where a branch has fell off, it's still got a hole. And you take and you put that piece of parchment paper folded up in the tree. You fold it up, that parchment paper up 3 times, put it in a tree, blow on it, and you're blowing your intention of you wanting this person out of your life. You want them, or out of the other person's life that's commissioned you. You want them gone. And it works. So it's all really about petition. And you're really petitioning in Appalachian witchcraft. You're also a lot of times prayer was involved on stuff. You would blow on it and then you would say a prayer or a psalm, depending on what you're doing. And it was really all about petitions and intentions, realistically.
So then, in practicing Appalachian witchcraft, do you just deal with ancestors? Do you have spirits? Do you have, I don't know, saints? I mean, who do you work with? Is it just the ancestors, or?
Well, I'm more really eclectic on a lot of things. In traditional Appalachian witchcraft, it usually was Jesus, God, and your ancestors. You work with the Bible. The Bible was your handbook. You know, Christianity was a big part in it. For me, you can kind of see it behind me here is the Bebes of Papa Legba and Baron Samdi. Um, I'm a Mambo and Voodoo, and I do a little bit of Voodoo and Hoodoo. And in my practice of my years, I work with them personally, along with the ancestors and spirits of the graveyard. You know, that comes from doing the hoodoo and a lot of the things. In one of my upcoming future classes, I'll be talking about working in the graveyard. You work with spirits in the graveyard, the ancestors there as well. But most of the time in traditional Appalachian witchcraft, you're only using the ancestors and Jesus and God.
Here and there. What would you say is the most important thing you need for the ancestral altar, and what do you suggest to whoever's, just starting out?
That's a great question. I would make sure one of the biggest things is put it in a high traffic area in your home. You know, there's taboo still. We've even ran into it here. You have taboo putting an altar out where everyone can see it. Don't do that. Put it out where people can see it. You wouldn't hide a family member in the closet. Don't hide them in the closet. They do get irritated about that. So, uh, put it out. They don't have to. You can do as simple as you want, or as complicated as you want. You could do a white cloth on the table. Just give them a little offering for some, like a little dish of water, something for food, candies. Mine, it has tobacco. My papa loved tobacco. Um, I give him a pipe full of tobacco every day. I have a shot of whiskey up there. That was one of his favorite things. I have Werther's caramel candies up here for my grandmother. And then I have the knife up here and just different things from our travels that we like to do together. Like I have the antlers back here. I actually managed to get these out of the woods that were dropped, and me and Papa used to hunt. So it's things that remind you of them, the things that you shared experiences together. If you have pictures, even better. But my biggest things I would say is make sure it's clean, set it up in a high traffic area, and make sure you have a way to offer them nutrition and some money. One of the big things is I leave change up there. I have some pennies, quarters, some dollar bills. One of the big things in Hoodoo that we work with is leaving money for the dead, so they have money to spend as well in the spirit world.
Money on mine. I also offer Oreo cookies because my sister is on my altar and she loved Oreo cookies in life. So, I figure in death, she'll love them as well. And that's kind
Yeah,
of one of the things that I teach when I'm telling people about ancestral altars. And also, don't put it in the bedroom because it's considered disrespectful unless you have to
yep,
keep it covered. The other
yep.
thing is no living on the ancestral altar. If there's a picture of you and say grandma or something, you have to cut you out of it.
Yeah, that's
And the
taboo.
last little rule is offerings. You're not supposed to take them down unless they spoil. And even whenever you do that, you have to divine first. Do you agree with those, or do you have anything to add to that?
The only thing I do a little differently, and everyone's a little different, is my offerings stay up there. The the rum or the whiskey, whichever one I'm using that day, it's gone. It's usually gone within a couple of days. Like I used to be very skeptical when first starting into witchcraft, and I was like, no way. And I've seen some things living around here that's opened my eyes that made me a believer. I live in the oldest mountains in the world. Excuse me. My whiskey or rum, depending on who that one's going to be for that day, whether it's for the low Oz or it's for my ancestors, on this one or in there, it's gone. Give it 2 days, it's gone. And it's not evaporate. My house stays humid. I'm in East Tennessee. It's humid. It doesn't evaporate. It's gone. Um, but yeah, for sure. With my offerings, I usually give the tobacco like when it goes stale. I take it and I return mine to the earth because it came from earth and I send it back to earth. And most of mine are, and the same with the food. The food came from earth and it goes back to the earth. And that one of the things I have to do is I have big dogs. I have one dog. I love him to death. He's big and he can reach the top of this. And I don't put chocolate out or something like that. Like I look at the ancestors not talking. I was like, I hope you guys understand, but I don't want my dog getting poisoned by an Oreo.
Yeah.
And so yeah, definitely. And when I take my offerings down, I sometimes divine on it. I sometimes don't. I'm usually talking with them if I'm near the altar. I've made it a habit in my life to sit just to talk with them as I'm passing. Hey, hello, or oh, I look at the altar if the offerings are looking bad. I'm like, oh, I apologize. Let me get you a fresh, let me clean this up for you. Let me freshen this up. And they're
It's just
usually
like
pretty
having a
happy with
guest
that.
over.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So, okay, the ancestral altar, you obviously need to have one of those. What other,
Mhm.
I guess, tools would you have if you were just kind of starting out? What would you use?
Yeah, candles, 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 candles. You can never have too many candles. Um, all the colors, all the colors. That was a big thing was color significance, color magic, candle magic. I have a buttload, and I've actually started learning to make my own because it's cheaper to make my own as much as I go through them. You can go as cheap as tea lights. I've got 2 tea lights lit up right behind me right now. Tea lights are great. Candles. I've got pillar candles, 7 day candles. Candles are your big thing. Other than that, notebooks. Uh, get yourself a few notebooks. Spend some money. Get yourself some nice journals, some nice pens. Part of this journey is writing things down. It was an oral tradition, um, and it was oral and somewhat written, and what's written is what's mostly made it through because it stopped. The oral tradition has really stopped as much as it. There's only a few people out teaching this now, and there's been a lot lost because a lot of the people up in the Smoky Mountains and in the Appalachians could never read or write. They never had a high school or even sometimes most of them barely had an elementary school education. Some of them never went to school. And so a lot of this was always passed on over oral tradition. And now it's that we're advanced enough now we can start making books. So get a notebook, write some stuff down, candles, um, jars, jars,
Jars.
educate,
Witches love jars.
absolutely jars. Yep, witches love jars. Absolutely jars. I definitely use mason jars. Um, if you're gonna get into doing oils, which I'll be holding classes on oils and powders and stuff of that nature in the future as well. You know, I'll teach more of the basics you need for doing oils or powders and stuff. But getting the oils, make sure you get real oils. Do your research. If you're not going to make your own oils of your own essential oils or your own tonic oils, make sure you're getting something that are not going to break you out or anything because some of the stuff is topical. Um, Herbs. Start learning herbs. I'll be holding classes on teaching root work from A to Z. So start learning your herbs. Those are the biggest things around here. And even if you don't live in the Appalachians, a lot of people I know are interested in this that don't live in this region, and we do have some things here that only grow here. Um, but they're substitutions. Learn your herbs. That's one of the biggest things. Set up your ancestor altar, and honestly, that's what that's your bare bones basics you need to start right there.
Well, you mentioned that Christianity is involved with it. Is that the same as being a Christian witch, or is that completely different?
You know, I've not really just really paid much attention. Not talking bad about them at all. I've just it's not one avenue I've went down with learning it about Christian witchcraft. I have in the insights of it from their viewpoint. I've learned it from my viewpoint of, the Psalms, not trying to stir any pots here, but the Psalms, they are spells. The book of Psalms is what you in Appalachian Conjure, you use it as a spell book. It is you speak those Psalms so many times, and that's what they done. You're in a house and you're talking and you're saying these things over and over, you're praying and someone's listening. So I don't know. I can't really say because I don't know have the knowledge enough of Christian witchcraft if it's the same or not. But I do know I would say there's a lot of similarities in there, but I wouldn't necessarily call it a Christian witch because there's still a lot of pagan beliefs that follow into it. Um, All Saints Day, Samhain was still celebrated. Um, Yule is a very big thing. Yule's very much still celebrated. There's still traditions that a lot of people in the South do to this day that are doing at this moment around here, preparing for the holidays that came from pagan traditions. Some of them are from the Nordic times, some of them were from Gaelic times, some of them Scottish, all over. Um, so I really wouldn't say it's Christian witchcraft, not really, but I would say it probably has some similarities to it.
You just mentioned some of the Sabbats. Do you celebrate all the Sabbats, or is it just a few of them?
I personally celebrate all of them. A lot of them did. A lot of them but in different ways. Over time, I'm assuming when they came in, they would still celebrate that Sabbats, and it's changed over the years. Um, around in the South, we have harvest festivals and stuff around the time of harvest, and that's one of the big things. Because you used to have harvest festivals back in the early times. You brought in the whole town gathered together and performed blessings for the winter coming and prepared for the winter coming and put the harvest away and celebrated. And that was usually around Samhain. And then they also honored the ancestors and gave the ancestors some of their harvest that year. Um, we do Yule for sure. We do Yule. Um, the coming in of spring. We I've known some of them who still do dance. I know some of them who still practice Appalachian witchcraft that will still dance around the maypole. That does happen, and everyone's a little different. I don't practice all the Sabbats, but I do practice some of them. Not saying anything against any of them. It's just tradition that is how we grew up around here and how I grew up around here practicing some of them. There were some that we did and some that we didn't.
Okay, great. Now, where did you learn all of this from exactly? Was it passed down through your family? Did you have books? How did you learn?
Multiple sources. Most of I didn't even notice I was learning it as a kid until I got older and started doing more research into it. So a lot of it I grew up doing. One of the ways of divination that I learned that's as simple as kneading your dough. I used to watch my grandma knead a dough or a faith of fresh loaf of bread or banana bread or something or muffins. Excuse me. And she'd be able to tell you if it was going to rain. And she was right 100% of the time. Like the weatherman would be wrong. And it's one of them if the dough was pulling too far apart and getting too stretchy and in there. Yeah, that was a sign it was going to storm because the humidity's too high around here. At that time I didn't know what that was, and they didn't know that back in the early Appalachian times either. Um, Stuff as simple as that. Another way that I've learned it is through books. There is a great author named Jake Richards out there. I've learned a lot from him. There was a lot of things that tied things together, and that was when the light bulb came on. And then talking to the old timers, I moved out of Tennessee for several years, and then I moved back, and I started taking more interest. Now I wasn't a teenager in the history of the place, and this place is rich in history. East Tennessee is very rich in history, and the Smoky Mountains are very rich in history. And just going around and listening to old timers, just go around, sit down, have a glass of sweet tea, and sit down and talk with them. And a lot of them will be more than happy to tell you some stories. And one thing I learned, the folk stories that are around here usually have some truth to them.
Hmm.
You know,
Yep.
there's usually truth in there, especially in these mountains. You know, these
Yeah.
mountains are old. These mountains are ancient. Legitimately, they were around before bones were, and there's some very ancient spirits in them, and there's a lot of stories that go along with them, and 95% of them are true. You know, good and bad. So, and then one of the things I do is I talk with the spirits. I have a unique gift with my empathy. Um, I've passed on 3 times now. I've died 3 times in my life, and I have a unique way of talking with the spirits. I can kind of shift back and forth and talking with them in a way. So a lot of the things that I've learned is working with the ancestors, and I would say was one of the biggest ways is, and one of the hardest things of learning to work with the ancestors is learning to stop moving this and use these. Is learning to listen. Um, that's one of the biggest things with them. All of a sudden, you have a gut feeling about doing something. It's usually ancestors backing you up, and that's a big thing in here. You know, I've learned some things and started winging some things with different spells and different herbs, and then the ancestors have taught me some of these things, and I'm writing it down. And that's why I say write it down, because you look back and reflect on it, and then you have a base to do research on, and you go back and you're like, oh no, wait, this has been being done for a long time now. This is a remedy from way back in back in the early 1800s and whatnot. So a lot of different ways to learn about it. If someone was starting to start out in this, I would definitely look up Jake Richards. He's a great author to check out, and he's definitely very informative. If I'm not mistaken, he grew up not too far down from me, so he knows a lot of the same stuff. And uh, then just look. One of the ways I could say is join my classes, because there's not many people teaching this anymore. If you don't live here, it's hard to learn the traditions. And if you do live here around these areas, go look up your local history. Go talk to an old timer about some of their old ways, old traditions, or how did their grandparents do some things. How did their grandparents set up their Christmas tree? Be a great question right now, because it was completely different back then than it is now. You know, just listen to the stories and progress. I'm in the process of starting some books up and getting it some thoughts and plots wrote down and stuff on it and getting it figured out. Um, so Books Unlimited, like I said, Jake Richards, Backwoods Witchcraft, great book. And if I'm not mistaken, he just put out another book too. I can't remember its name right now, but I'm pretty sure he did, and I got to check that one out. Um, if you don't live in the area and you can't find a teacher on it, and I have found a couple over the years, they don't teach it from the perspective of someone that lives here. They teach it without the Appalachian soul in it. And I don't know how to put that really any other way. It's not trying to sound cheesy or anything. There's a certain way that we did things, and you only knew those from being here. And because no one else did them. They're unique. We're very unique people around here. Um, well, shoot, we had the Malungans up in the mountains. They're very unique people. They have their own traditions and everything, and theirs is strictly passed down through oral tradition, and it's pretty much gone of that at this point. And that's why Appalachian witchcraft is starting to fade out, is because it's used to be strictly by oral tradition. Again, because a lot of people couldn't read or write or afford the book to write it down in, and it's an area of poverty, and so there's not a lot of information on it unless you just have some grandma's keepsakes or something from down in here, someone who grew up down here. So that's one of the big things I'm wanting to do is let the tradition live, keep it going, pass it down orally and through some books, because it's rich in history, and I love history, and I love how we grew up around here, and I'm proud of it, and want to keep it going. So one of the ways I could say is attend my classes. You know, I'm about to be people who are living in the areas that are close by. You know, I'm here soon. Another thing that's in the works is I'm working with another person on setting up an apothecary. We're going to be doing in-person classes where you can do hands-on with learning certain roots and how to make certain things, and then there will be Zoom classes on how to the history of it. There'll be weekly. It's a weekly Zoom class. We'll be doing weekly Zoom classes on the history, the root work, and some of the basic spells and stuff around it. Um, I don't know yet if it's going to be individual classes or I'm going to go open one down the line. Probably going to have individual classes. But there will be weekly classes on that where I pass down some of my knowledge. And it's kind of hard to learn about it because unless you're just down here and you know people, I mean, you don't just go up to some random person's house, especially in this day and age. It used to be you could go up to a random person's house down here, knock on the door, and say, "Hey, I'm so and so, and I want to learn. Do you have any stories to tell? I just want to sit down and hear a story, sit for a spell." And people were friendly like that. And it's not trying to talk bad about the South, but the world's getting a little scarier, and it's not. You just don't do that no more. So it makes it harder to learn it. So yeah, it's definitely kind of hard, and just getting to the point now, it's getting to be hush hush, and that's a problem because it was an oral tradition, and those will die if we do not speak of them.
That's true. So there's no grimoire or book of shadows that's passed down.
No, if you want to call it that, it's usually your grandmother's cookbook. Believe it or not, we used to have her cookbook, and she'd have things written down in there for the food because even certain witchcraft in the kitchen, it was definitely a thing. The intention while making the food. Um, Definitely a big part of Appalachian witchcraft living. You just I want this food to heal someone sick, and you're making them some chicken broth or something with a little bit of noodles or something in it. And in the back of it was usually little notes from different things in life, and then sometimes you would have little diaries or little journals that they would have with certain things in it. And if you were a relative of a granny, the granny would pass down the books, and then over time of it being modernized and moving into the modern age, those are long gone. I've honestly never laid an eye on an original Granny's book. Never seen one because they usually had them as something like a grimoire, a book of shadows, or the different things they would do, and that would help pass it down in traditions. And I knew my great grandparents before they passed on who lived down in here, and they didn't even have theirs. So that shows you how far back that the tradition started changing. So if we could ever find one of those, that would be pretty awesome.
Yeah, that would be. What
What
about
about
contacting the spirits or the ancestors? Is there a certain way that you do that? Is it a special ritual, or is everybody different?
Everyone's a little different on that. That's one of the greatest things about this is, certain paths you would take require you to do things a strict or certain way. Some are more free flowing. Again, this path is especially contacting the ancestors. It's more along the lines of just always being in contact with them. Hey, how are we doing? Or do you have any advice today? Hey, I've lost this. Can you help me? Or here's you some food or water, or always talking with them. I don't have no specific way of doing it. And if someone has their own specific ritualistic way of contacting the ancestors, then by all means go for it. Because that's what works for you. And that was the big thing. Everyone was different back then too. We did what worked for us, and every person had a little different thing.
So it's a little bit of everything then.
deities?
Are there
Um,
certain deities that you work with, or are there any that you work with?
Uh, Personally, I work with some Lawas where I do Path of Voodoo and Path of Hoodoo as well. I work with Lawas. Saints are worked with a lot. From the Hoodoo path of things, and then it was really just God and Jesus. Christianity. It was one of the biggest things that went into it was them. It was the transition between the pagan times and the Christian times in the timeline of history. Um, so there was influences on both. Um, of still in there. So you had Christian, I would pray to God. They would read the Bible. They would sing the hymns. They would gather together, and then they would still have their superstitions and stuff. Then the way they did certain things, and it even affected the way they worship God and the way Christianity was back then. It was different than it is now down in here, and that's just how they did it, and it was just mainly God. And then if they had to do some left-handed work, there's no real true deities in the early times or in the original times of doing it. Here in the Appalachian Mountains, they're spirits, and they work with spirits. And that was the big thing. It's not just working with your ancestors, it's working with the spirits that are around you. And that's one of the biggest things about the Appalachian conjure is working with the spirits in the Appalachians. You can work with, you apply them and use it in the Appalachian other places. It's not got the same spirits, but there's certain spirits that live here that don't have names. No one's named them. They're old. And that was the biggest thing they would do if they had to do left-handed work or they needed some extreme right-handed work. They would work with the spirits that are around them and then ask God to help them and bless them and everything.
Okay. What about during ritual? When you're having a ritual, with basic witchcraft, especially Wicca, we call quarters. Do you do anything like that? I mean, do you have, the elements that you work with, or?
I do, again, because I do hoodoo, and a little voodoo. Back then, no, not really. They didn't really call quarters in. They wouldn't call them in a traditional sense. They would have effigies of their own or some sort that would symbol the quarters. You would have like a candle for the fire, um, using the smoke off the fire for the wind, and then you're on Earth. I mean, they lived in huts in small towns back then, so Earth was everywhere. And a lot of times they lived by a stream, so they had water. Um, so they wouldn't necessarily, in any other forms where you absolutely are sitting there and calling them in. You wouldn't necessarily really call them in. The Yorubas, if they were doing some hardcore rituals or the grannies, occasionally, yeah, they would call it in and they would call in their circle, but it would be more along the lines of setting their ward, their personal circle up, and nothing's crossing this. This is mine. Grannies were fierce. When it came down to get their hands dirty and get their knuckles bloody, they were fierce, spiritually and physically. When they said there was a line, there was a line. Nothing came through it. Yeah.
What?
It's a memory. It's a memory that came back not too long ago. I dream a lot with certain memories, and they come in with my experiences with my ancestors and the spirits. One of the memories that came back, I would say a few weeks ago, it was an interesting one. I remember growing up, we were still in the old house before we got their newer house, and we were still in a house with a dirt floor, and I was a little bitty baby. My grandparents raised me here in East Tennessee. Um, and I remember I wasn't like, I don't know, I wasn't a baby. I think I was like 2 or 3 years old, and I had a really bad fever. Like it was fast fever, and I was seizing. And I remember laying on my grandmother's chest, and I remember my papa, he used to have a cigar or a tobacco pipe, and he would load tobacco in it, um, lit the tobacco, and then blew it on my forehead. And then for 3 days, I couldn't break that fever. And when he blew it on my forehead, an hour later, I broke the fever.
Wow.
And then I was fine 2 days later. And that's a perfect example of Appalachian witchcraft. And I would say that was my very first exposure to it. I can remember because I was thinking back on that. What was my first exposure to this? And that's the first one I can remember.
So it goes way back.
It goes way back. Yeah, because tobacco is a healing herb. It's a poisonous herb as well, but it's a multi-purpose herb or root. But it's a healing herb, and it goes to the healing intention of him blowing the breath.
Mm-hmm.
That came from the Gaelic. The breath, movement of the breath, the intention on the breath, and so that was one of the prime examples of it. And then it worked. And then we were trying modern medicine and everything. I remember my mom used to tell me all the time, my grandparents used to tell me all the time growing up that story. And they were like, I'd already been in the ER and everything. And then I went down enough, they sent me home, and it still was bad enough that like it was gnarly. My papa did that. And yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of amazing. You spoke about the breath. Isn't that like a big deal in hoodoo and voodoo, using your breath, using your energy?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a big thing in it, using your breath in hoodoo and voodoo. And that was a big thing from the Gaelic and the Nordic. Really in all of magic that I've studied in some way or another, they touch on it. Words have power. Words have power because your breath has power because it's the intention that's behind it. So when the intention That's really all it is. It's just you're using your breath is just a mode of transportation for the intention. Doing root work, there's traditions with it and there's rules with it that you do. Like if you're doing left-handed work, say you're building a left-handed or you're doing a gree, it's a bad gree, it's a left-handed one. Um, like say someone's wronged you and you're building one, you're gonna build it with your left hand. You're not gonna touch it with your right hand, and you're gonna put the roots in it with the left hand, and you're gonna seal it away, facing away from you. If you want it, the intention to go towards you, you seal it facing you. If you want to go to somewhere else, you seal it away from you. Streams are a big thing. You use streams for a lot of things. You want to send it on down. That's the same thing as the breath, but further. You take your spell, you would put it in a stream and send it on down, and it would find its way to the owner, the intended owner. Um, if you're healing, you would do you would mention on healing, you would use your right hand. They still believed in the power of rocks back then too. You had rocks, you had crystals, you had gemstones if they came across them. They mined them up here. They believed in those too. So they would use some of those here and there. But yeah, it's definitely one of the biggest things is if you're doing left-handed work, use your left hand. If you're doing right-handed work, use your right hand.
Okay. What is the difference in the Appalachian witchcraft and like voodoo? Is there a difference or are they about the same?
It's really about the same, honestly, with the Greek, studying the Greek from both perspectives. It's not much different. Um, they sewed up a doll and they filled it with herbs that they knew had certain intentions. Like, if you were wanting to harm someone, you filled a herb with, or you filled a doll with herbs that would harm someone. Um, and then you sewed it up and then you breathed life into it. One of the biggest things that kind of struck me as odd is, and amazing is not so much odd, but as amazing as in voodoo and hoodoo and in granny magic, I've seen instances and I was taught instances from orally where in voodoo, when you make a gree, you have a gree altar you make it on. You have the representative of the four elements on that altar, and you make the gree in the center of them as the spirit. They did the same thing then.
Okay.
And then
And you can use it for
it was
healing
still,
though, correct? The
oh,
poppets and the dolls.
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. If someone would had some really bad sickness that they would know that if we get too close, this I'm going to catch this and I don't want this. Absolutely. You can use them for healing all the time. And that was one of the main reasons they were used. It wasn't always, there's a bad connotation on the voodoo dolls and the grees and all that, but there's plenty of times they were used for healing. Um, Probably more than the negative times, honestly.
Streams, are there other places you go to for different types of workings?
Yeah, absolutely. Mainly I'll prep, like if I'm doing a multi-part, like I say I'm doing a spell with a mojo bag in it or a gree of some sort or anything, I prep it here at home on my work altar and then I'll go to the woods. I personally always go to the woods because I go into the Appalachian Mountains. The Smoky Mountains is the oldest part of the Appalachian Mountains, and it's the only temperate rainforest in the eastern side of the United States. And I go into the Smoky Mountains. I stay out of the actual park area so I don't get in trouble by park rangers, but I go into the mountains and I do my work in there. I go home. The mountains call me home. That's why I've moved back here. So I go to my house and go in there and work with the spirits of the mountains and the ancestors there. For a modern practitioner wanting to start out, I would recommend the woods. If you have woods nearby or anywhere, go walk in the woods. It's peaceful, it's serene, it's quiet. Go find you a stream. I go work by streams. If I'm doing some work I want to send on to someone else instead of for myself, I do it by stream so I can send it down the stream. One of the things is fire. If you're doing some hot work, you're working with a hot spirit or you're passionate about something. If you are doing love work or you're doing or some kind of like firewall protection work or things are getting heated and you need to step it up, do it around a fire, go to the woods, go to a campground in the woods. Let me rephrase that. Do never start a fire in the woods. But do it around a fire in the woods. Like I have some campgrounds in the woods up here I go up to. They have fire rings and stuff, and then I'll do they're pretty secluded and I go do it up there. It's all about finding where you do it at home. And that's where I do. I just go and walk in the woods sometimes, and just for nothing better to do, just go walk in the woods and find my home in there, find my serenity. Society gets too cramped, and I go in there and I calm down. And sometimes you just walk on to places you take a mental note of, and like, I might come back to this for some work at some point in time.
So why don't you tell everyone how to get in touch with you and what it is that you're offering on your Patreon?
Okay, yeah, absolutely. Thank you for asking. You can get a hold of me on Facebook, Dr. Bones Appalachian Conjure. It's the same name on Patreon. There's a link to my Gmail on both of the pages as well. You can get a hold of me through there for any conjure work or divination needs or any questions or concerns. On my Patreon, we're gonna have there's a student package where you get a 1 hour class once a week, plus the PDF file for any recipes or anything that needs to be written down that you can keep. Some of it's gonna be old recipes and stuff, and old spells and old stuff, so it's getting passed down. So you get that for free with it. Then we have Student Plus, which is the $15 package. You're gonna get the same 1 hour class and the same PDF file accesses. Plus, you're gonna have once a month we're gonna have a conjure card reading virtually, and that's for the group. If someone wants to learn how, that way people can start picking up how conjure cards work and stuff, kind of explore them, bring them into the world. And then there's also back behind the scenes footage of and photos of me doing work in the graveyards or different places doing some works. And then there's a way you can get a hold of me on there for divination, and if you need conjure work on the Patreon as well, plus my Gmail.
Okay, great. Okay, that concludes this episode of Everyday Witchcraft. I'd like to say a special thanks to our guest, Dr. Bones, and we will be seeing him again on the show with other interesting topics. So we will see you soon. Blessed be.